Our next speaker thinks a lot about what happens to people after retirement, and he runs a think tank now on boomers and work and purpose, and essentially what it means to find purpose in the next part after midlife. Please welcome Marc Freedman.
Thank you. Joseph Campbell, the expert on myths, said, midlife is when you get to the top of the ladder and discover it's leaning against the wrong wall. And I hit 50, which I guess qualifies as midlife, and I wasn't so sure the wall was the wrong one, but the ladder was definitely listing. And I decided I would take a break. At almost the same time, I picked up a copy of Harvard Business Review, the one that has its big ideas for the year, and there was a piece in there by Mary Catherine Bateson, the daughter of Margaret Mead, and she had a line that really resonated. She said that we'd stretch midlife so long it had become like a run-on sentence that was desperately in need of punctuation. And I decided I was going to get me some punctuation. Not exactly a period, because I had two small kids already, a baby and a 2-year-old, so there wasn't going to be a lot of period in the future. Comma just didn't seem quite enough, and then it hit me, the semicolon, right? I needed myself a semicolon, and I decided I was going to get a sabbatical. I talked to my colleagues and my board, and they said I could take 3 months off. I was so excited. I planned a trip to Australia. I cashed in all my frequent flyer miles. I bought a stack of books about Melbourne and Sydney, and as the time to leave drew closer, I was about a week away from it, I realized I had no interest in going to Australia for 3 months to spend that time in a hotel room with a screaming baby and a 2-year-old. In fact, a sabbatical is what you needed to recover from the 3 months in the hotel room. So I bailed out, and I later discovered that it turns out one of the great sources of human happiness, there's now a whole body in behavioral psychology about this, is planning a fantastic vacation and then not going on it. Suddenly I was awash in free time, no, airport security lines and strip searches. But so I called United Airlines up, and for a mere $1,000, they permitted me not to go to Australia. I was generous of them. I informed my wife about this, and her eyes started rolling, but we decided we got to do something. I live in San Francisco. We decided to go on a car trip to Portland, Oregon, up the Pacific Northwest. We couldn't make it all the way, so I was back planning. I realized we could make it about as far as the town of Medford. I called up hotels there. I finally got the cheapest rate I could find at the Homewood Suites in Medford, Oregon. And what's that cheapest rate? It's not AAA, it's the AARP discount. I got my senior discount, and I was so proud of myself. I just saved us $8.14. I rushed out of the office, informed my wife, who seemed to remember the $1,000 for not going to Australia, and her only question was, did you get the 2 cribs? I call back, and the 18-year-old guy on the phone answers, and I says, Mr. Freedman, yeah, Mr. Senior Citizen Discount, can I have 2 cribs? And in that moment, I realized I had become an oxymoron. Remember in grade school when they talked about the oxymoron, the little giant? Well, we heard it already this morning in the first talk, the young old, the working retired, the walking dead. Newsweek had a cover story recently, Dead Suit Walking. A lot of us are becoming oxymorons. And you hear it in other ways too, right? 60 is the new 30, it's the new 40. There was even a poll last year to determine finally whether it was the new 40 or 50 or 30. But from my discount experience, I knew 60 is also the new 80 too. So which is it? Is it our lost youth, or is it our premature old age? And as a society, I think we face the same kind of confusion, right? You go to the doctors, and what do they tell you? You should walk around the block, reduce your stress, eat cruciferous vegetables. You're supposed to live well so you can live long. That's the goal, and we've done spectacular things on that front. Right? Life expectancy in this country is 47. At the turn of the last century, it's close to 80 now. It's been a big triumph, but if you pick up the editorial page, all you hear about is this long gray wave of greedy geezers about to take America to the cleaners, bankrupt posterity. And I kid you not, there was an article in the Atlantic Monthly, one of the great magazines in this country, a few years ago, titled "The Coming Death Shortage," right? So how is it how is it that the best thing that ever happened to us, these long, healthier lives, turns out to be the worst thing as a society? The best thing for us as individuals is this collective calamity. A great book, Christopher Buckley's Boomsday a few years ago, provided one way out of that dilemma. It's euthanasia for boomers at 70, right? Families got, iPods and green stamps and things like that. Just in case that resolution doesn't work, I'm here to talk to you about another possibility, which is that a lot of the hand-wringing about what this future aging of society is going to mean amounts to scenario planning through the rear-view mirror. It's essentially taking the new numbers, and all those people are already alive, right? Doubling of the population over 65. And the old lifestyle, those golden years of our parents and grandparents' generation, and assuming social collapse. But in reality, the nature of later life in this country and elsewhere is changing every bit as radically as the numbers are. And so, instead of 60 is the new 30 or 40 or the new 80, I'd say it's the one point I would want to impart today, to go back to Dan Pink's advice earlier. It's that 60 is the new 60. And the tens of millions of people flooding into this period are themselves something entirely new on the landscape. They're the residents of a new stage of life, one that doesn't yet have a name. And that sounds counterintuitive, to put it charitably. New stages of life. Stages of life are like the oxygen in the air or the seasons of a year. You don't just invent fall, and insert it between summer and winter. But it turns out when it comes to life stages, it's always been that way. Life stages are unnatural acts. They're concoctions to solve social problems. It's true of retirement in this country. In 1948, Walter Reuther, the great labor leader, described retirees as too old to work, too young to die. It was essentially this ante-room to death. 10 years later, it was a cornerstone of the American dream. A guy by the name of Del Webb opened Sun City around the notion of the golden years. And there's a great scene the night before Sun City opened. His lieutenants are sitting around a table, and one of them finally pipes up, "How am I ever going to sell a 30-year mortgage to somebody who's 65 years old?" Hell, maybe we should have thought about that before putting the $4 million into the project. Next day, 100,000 people show up. There's a traffic jam for 20 miles leading into Peoria, Arizona. And it's not just later life where we've invented new stages. There was barely a sense of childhood at the beginning of the country. We used to dress kids up as little adults and expect them to act accordingly. Adolescence, right? If the golden years was a second adolescence, a chance to play, the first adolescence did not exist between 1904, and guess what? It was invented by a 60-year-old recovering from a midlife crisis, a guy by the name of G. Stanley Hall, who was described in a New York article recently as a man who told 14 lies before lunch. He's also the guy who invented psychology in America. American Psychological Association, he invented it. American Journal of Psychology, he invented that too. He was really a remarkable figure, and in 1904, he published a book called Adolescence. Had a very long subtitle, it was 1,000 pages, and it essentially invented youth. There would be no junior up if it hadn't been for G. Stanley Hall. And he invented adolescence in a context where there's a proliferation of young people who weren't quite children, they weren't adults anymore, just like there's the proliferation of us who aren't quite in midlife anymore, who aren't in old age. And it caught on, and all of a sudden we had adolescence, a moratorium period, at a time when there was a lot of disruption, urbanization, immigration, concerns about all these young people who would be running amok, who had physical maturity but lacked the emotional maturity of adults. It took 40 years till we invented the word teenager, and that came with 17 magazine in 1944. But I tell you the story in part because it shows how these life stages are artifacts, but also it turns out that G. Stanley Hall is the guy who invented this stage of life between midlife and old age. 20 years later, almost, in 1922, he published another book, said, "I made a big mistake. I should have invented a new stage of life between midlife and old age." And he described it beautifully as an Indian summer. He said that human beings didn't reach the height of their capacity until the shadows started slanting eastward. And promptly passed away, and that was the end of it. He called it senescence, which may have been the reason that it never caught on. But now, we're at this point where 10,000 boomers a day, these big numbers of people are flooding into this period that has no name, into this neither nor oxymoronic status. And I think it's time to take call seriously, to think about what that Indian summer might look like, especially because the people who are flooding into that period, just like those adolescents around the turn of the last century, are seen as this huge problem. You know, how can we afford to have a quarter of the population spending a third of their life in subsidized leisure? It's unsustainable. It is unsustainable for us individually, financially, for the society, so we have to come up with something new or something old. This idea of an Indian summer. So I think we're poised at this period, but it's one thing to look back and see how we invented these stages at previous times. It's another to look forward, right? You know, we invented a life course that was set up for 70, but now half the children born in the developed world since 2000 are going to see their 100th birthday, not just here, but in Europe and Asia. What's a life course for a 100-year lifespan look like? And I think it starts with a vision for this period. Sure, it should be a time of productivity and continued growth, a time that's not halfway an earlier period and halfway a later one, something that has its own integrity. But I think it's all really about time. When you hit your 50s, and I've felt this myself, I'm sure many of you have thought about these questions as well. A couple weeks after Steve Jobs' death, it's on everybody's mind at 56. The road doesn't go on forever, right? You don't realize that when you're 18 or 22. You shouldn't. But when you're 50 or 60, it starts dawning on you. The time matters more. It has a weight that it didn't carry at an earlier part in our life. And yet at the same time, and I think this is for the first time ever, people who are realizing that that road doesn't go on forever, it's probably going to go on for quite a bit longer, right? You know, life expectancy, we heard in the very talk today, for people at 65 has jumped. So we see a kind of expansion and compression of time. And at the same time, there's a sense of urgency, right? You know, the road is finite, but it's probably going to last a lot longer, and then you remember how fast the last 25 years shot by. It reminds me of the French Revolution slogan. Remember, liberty, equality, fraternity. I can never remember what order it goes in. This is like mortality, longevity, and urgency. And I think the end result is what makes this period a potential crown of life, because I think for the first time ever, we've got millions of people who have an enormous amount of experience, a new insight into what matters, and the time to do something with it. And then you multiply that by demography, so mortality, longevity, urgency, and demography, you really have something. What you don't have necessarily is a name, right? You know, Hall talked about senescence. You hear lots about second acts and third acts and middlescence, and there are a bunch of labels that are beginning to appear around this stage. And I was facing a deadline for this book that I wrote in April of this year, and I didn't have any name, and I was absolutely beside myself. I found myself poised over the laundry hamper opposite my mother-in-law, who's a very witty person, and I asked her, I said, Donna, I can't figure out what to call the stage. She said, oh, no, I've got a name for it. I talk to my sister Pat about it all the time. Said, what should I call it? She said, I'm on my next to last dog. Right? The way she figures it is she's got about 6-7 years left on the current pooch. Then she can get a mid-size for about another 14 years. And it's not like she's going to be measured for a casket at that point, but you know, you got to clean up after it. I was really taken by this, right? We measure time in dog years. So I went to the website of the foremost expert on longevity in the country, a guy named Tom Pearls, and I put in all of her information, and according to that, she's going to live to 97. I had her do the same thing. She came out with 96 and informed me she knew some things about her life that I shouldn't know. And so I figured she's got at least two dogs in her. And then the crazy thing happened is Jack, the dog, died, right? So I told her she better get busy on all those legacy projects. But I don't use that word legacy lightly, because in addition to, you know, all of those itties that I used before, generativity is probably the key one, because when you do realize that life is finite, you realize two things. First of all, that human beings are a species, despite all the super longevity research, that passes on from generation to generation. Erik Erikson, the great psychologist of this period, said the hallmark of development, of successful development, this period could be encapsulated in one phrase: I am what survives of me. And I think when you get to this point, you really know what he meant. William James said the great use of life is to spend it for things that will outlast us. And I think that that's a critical element of what people are feeling at this stage. And the question is how we can fan it, how we can create this new stage of life so that graying isn't just paying or playing as it's been, but it's a kind of payoff. A payoff in human talent. Just think of the talent that was unleashed when women moved into the labor force in new roles in the 60s and 70s. It was an absolute windfall. A lot of us thought it was a zero-sum game at the time, but it turns out that we'd never be able to be competitively globally if it hadn't been for that case. And it could be even something more. I think that in this older population, I know this sounds almost blasphemous, is the new creative class. An economist at the University of Chicago, David Galenson, has studied creativity and genius, entrepreneurship, innovation in a whole range of fields. And what he's discovered is it's true that young people are a heartland of creativity, but that there's also a huge rise in creativity later in life, and he attributes it to different creative styles. Conceptual geniuses bloom early, experimental geniuses bloom late. And that's something that I've seen firsthand at Civic Ventures, the organization that I run. We give out something called the Purpose Prize, and it's a $100,000 prize for 5 people each year who are blooming late, who are doing their best work at the point when they're supposedly over the hill, and yet they're really on the rise. We give out 5 of these prizes. Last year we had 1,500 nominations for the 5 prizes. And one of the people who won the year before last, and I'll close with this because I think it encapsulates everything I'm trying to impart today, is a guy by the name of Robert Chambers, who was a Vietnam vet who'd worked in the banking business. It hadn't been a big success. You know, we're used to hearing about success to significance. He was in some ways mediocrity to significance. In fact, when he finally got to retire, which is his dream, moved to New Hampshire to bike, he didn't have enough money to retire, so he had to go back to work, and he started working at a used car dealership in Lebanon, New Hampshire. And he realized pretty quickly that all the money being made by this dealership was through ripping off unsophisticated rural buyers. Woodchucks in the parlance of that part of New Hampshire. They'd have special training seminars on how to take advantage of woodchucks. You'd see this happen over and over again. And one day a guy ends up getting sold a car that's got maybe 9 months left in it, and he's driving away, and Chambers is standing at the front glass doors of the place, smoke's belching out of the back, having taken a 5-year loan at 20% because his credit was lousy. And he realizes that this is not just a bad economic decision, but this is a huge tragedy. If you live in rural New Hampshire and you don't have a car, you can't work. So what happens when that car dies after 9 months or a year and he's got 4 more years of payments? And he couldn't afford to just run out the door and quit and make a big moral statement, but he started thinking he'd ride his bike, and he came up with the idea for Bonnie Clack, which was a new organization to provide credit counseling, low-interest loans, fuel-efficient new cars to low-income rural buyers. And he picked Clack because he's a big fan of car talk, of click and clack. He realized car loans and counseling could stand for clack. And it's been a spectacular success. And he got summoned to the White House last year to talk about it, an event for social innovation. Everybody else was under 30. And he got up and he said, "I was old enough to know injustice when I saw it, and experienced enough to do something about it." I can think of no better benediction for all the possibilities in these demographic transformations that are coming our way, right? This great midlife migration is not going to stop. Demography is destiny. But what we do with those demographic inexorable forces is up to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. So you argue in your talk and in your book, The Big Shift, that these life stages aren't so much real descriptions as they are social constructions, and that there might and that they shape the way we think about ourselves, depending on the life stage we're told we're in. And so there might be new stages that get introduced between midlife and old age. So what sort of social policy change or cultural change do you think would help that, to introduce a new stage between midlife and old age?
Yeah, well, you know, Shakespeare said there were 7 stages of life, and I think that we're actually at that point because there's another new stage emerging between adolescence and midlife, emerging adulthood. And I think the biggest issue for people, especially the people who are at that juncture now, is how do you get there? You know, what are the rites of passage? What are the routes, right? They used to have gold watches, and I think we need to help people make this transition. And the private sector can do a lot. We've got individual retirement accounts that are designed for a balloon payment of 30 years of leisure at the end of life. What about having individual purpose accounts that help people transition from what's last to what's next, and to do it in a way that's more efficient and less painful?
Great. Thank you so much, Mark.